New parents, I'm talking about naming practices, as Nina said. New parents spend considerable time deciding on names for their soon-to-be-born babies. It is seen as a serious undertaking. Naming practices refers, of course, to the process, where couples and perhaps extended family members make decisions about the name or names they will give their children. This paper examines naming practices in Italian migrant communities, arguing that it takes on an even more important role in this situation. Research into naming practices adds to the understanding of cultural identity for migrants and their children. It also addresses questions of cultural influences and changes in identity across generations, but it has received minimal attention, research attention. Today I want to share with you some preliminary insights from participant responses in my own study to the general question of familiar naming practices and naming choices. My research is a comparative study across 3 countries: Australia, United States of America and Canada. Looking into transgenerational cultural continuity for descendants of migrants. My aim in the bigger project is to investigate whether second and subsequent generations of children who grew up in Italian families living in one of those 3 identified countries maintain some degree of cultural continuity. My aim for this smaller paper today is to present participant recounts of their understanding of the decisions made by their parents and the decisions they made in naming their own children. The related issues of pronunciation and anglicising names is also discussed. My comments today are drawn to participant responses from Australia and the United States. We know from published literature that names can have a powerful distinguishing effect. The choices represent important cultural decisions because names are used to assess the competing influences and behaviours, attitudes and opinions of the host and home cultures. They can have long-term consequences as labels that influence the socialisation of children and contribute to the development of group and personal identities. For immigrants and their descendants... grazie.
Oh no, hai parlato troppo presto.
Yep, that's fine, thank you. I've got something to learn, which is most important. Okay, sorry people. For immigrants and their descendants, names can be a potent indicator of absorption in the host community. Communities provide children with their membership into the host, to safe identities through naming practices. We know that immigrants with culture-specific names bear a distinct social label that may result in a meaningful different set of social encounters, self-image and ethnic consciousness. For some, culturally specific names may validate cultural group identity. We also understand that the impact of the choice of first names for children of immigrants may be as strong or stronger measure of immigrant identity as generation, ethnic nationality, group consciousness, language or religion. Consistent with the literature, whatever the emphasis in this study, in my study, naming practices are not purely idiosyncratic, arbitrary or random labelling acts or decisions, but rather deliberate and meaningful actions situated in a specific geographic and temporal context. Names can reflect cultural absorption, assimilation or change for migrants and for the descendants. Names given to children at birth and the names they use in their host countries, of course, may be different. Historically, as we've heard several times already today, assimilation theorists from the early 50s have written that immigrants and their descendants are less likely to choose culturally specific names for their children as they become more embedded in the host country. They argue that the retention of culture-specific names obstructed successful integration into the host country, into the host community, predicting that eventually only surnames will distinguish descendants of migrants from others in the same community. The following comments from 2 older Australians but give a sense of what they feel has happened. Today you can't tell if someone's Italian. They were born here and they could not care less about something that happened in the other country. They're just not interested in the other country. Like Dad, never talked about the other country. He came out in 24, never returned even after the war. Then Tom, he says, my son, his children will carry our name, but apart from that, nothing else. They would not connect with Italy at all, at all. Okay, let's talk about anglicising names for a bit. Many, especially older participants, both in Australia and the United States, spoke of anglicising names. However, they spoke about anglicising names not as an indication of a weak sense of cultural identity, but more as a practical requirement to aid integration and to enhance employment and social opportunities. In the Australian context, several older participants indicated that they had deliberately anglicised their first names as children going to school, saying that they felt it was necessary when they were at school and or when they started to work. They added that over the years, these anglicised names became embedded into cultural common usage and remained in use today, whether the participant was interacting with Italians or with others in the wider community. So much so that they rarely reverted to their Italian pronunciation or version of their name, or Italian version of their name. Most indicated that they still introduce themselves today to people that they're meeting using the anglicised names, and that siblings and extended family members more often than not use the anglicised name when they're referring to each other. Differently to Australian participants, older participants in the United States spoke of parents anglicising their names, both their first and their family name, either at the point of entry or soon afterwards, and that they in turn were given American names. These two women who were sisters, both our parents were born in the United States of America. Our parents emigrated in the 1890s. Our father's name was anglicised. We assumed it was because that's what they did when they came through Ellis. Now their family name now is Smoke. There was much confusion about what the name was. It may have been Affumicato. More probably it was Fumo, a more common surname in Italy. But it could also have been Fumoso. There were multiple respondents from both countries who spoke about anglicising their name or that of their children, that they'd given Anglo names or they'd anglicise themselves, but with a link to their Italian cultural heritage. In the first example, the respondent is a second generation old participant from the US with an anglicised name, talking about the name he gave his children. I did not marry an Italian. I have 6 children. My children have anglicised names, but they are Italian related. Francis, John, Robert, Michael, Elizabeth and Joseph. They are names that can easily be in Italian, as you can see, Francesco, Giovanni, etc., etc. In the next couple of examples, the participants recorded that, the next example, the participant recorded that she and her husband, both grandchildren of Italian grandparents, chose a name that was more suited, that was their word, more suited to their family, saying, "We gave our daughter an Italian name. I love the name, but I definitely think European names are more suited to us rather than Australian names." Then there was a group of men who had married Anglo wives, and I've got a couple of examples from them. Angelo, we gave our children anglicised names that have a link with Italy, and it was not so much my choice as it was my wife's. There was the intent. They have an anglicised element, but there is a linkage to their Italian cultural heritage, and that was deliberate. Then we have Robert, who says, "My son Luca, his second name is Fiore, after my father. Luca is aware he's carrying a name that is Italian and that his middle name is that of his nome." That was deliberate. He knows of his heritage. We actually talk a lot. As he gets older, I would like him to know a little bit more, perhaps as much as I know about my father, and I would like Luca to go to Italy. This man lost his father quite young, when he was quite young, so he actually doesn't know that too much about his father, but that's why that's relevant in terms of what he says, as much as I know. And he lives, for the most part, a very Anglo-Australian life. Several participants who had second-generation mothers, that is, mothers of Italian immigrants, but who went to school here in Australia, and immigrant fathers spoke of their mother's awareness of problems associated with culture-specific names, thus selecting names that reflected a link to cultural heritage but were easily pronounced by their husbands and the wider Anglo community. Margaret is probably a good example. When I was born, my dad wanted to call me Domenica. Domenica was my grandfather's name. My mum said, "No, we're not going to call her Domenica because that name will make it difficult for her when she goes to school because people will not be able to say that name." Which was interesting because she obviously had a carryover from her own experiences. This is Margaret telling me this, they're not my words. Her name was Rosaria, but to this day she is known as Rosa. She said, "We have to have a name that you can say," that is, my father could say, but could also be easily translated, so they settled on Margherita, which is easy to say for an Italian and easily translated into English. I made no conscious decision to call myself Margaret, and now in hindsight I would call myself Margherita, but back then etc., etc. Others chose Anglo names because they were apprehensive about the consequences of those Italian names. Our children are Jason and Stephanie. We did not want them to be stuck with a name that may have been a burden to them. The Italian names are in fashion now, but back 20 years ago they were not in fashion. Their middle names are Italian. My children have Anglo names, but they have Italian, but they can be Italianised. They're Paul and Michael. We said we are in Australia. If you go overseas, you can call yourself your Italian name, and actually, I call them the Italian way. Anyway, Paoluccio and Paoluccio. I think it was because we had difficult names, and we said no. We just want plain and simple names, and names that if you do go overseas, you can Italianise them. Others, of course, chose Anglo names just because they liked them. My children have Skippy names, Monique and Michaela, just because we like them. Now, many participants spoke of having their name anglicised by others. For example, teachers and friends, and going along with it then because it seemed convenient or just simpler. But later as adults they have reverted to the Italian name and they announce themselves in the Italian way. Marianna is a good example by this. I go by my Italian name, not my anglicised name. On my birth certificate I have my anglicised name because my dad went to register me and he said, oh, whatever. And I have to say that is a reoccurring theme. I wanted my name in one word, and it comes from two aunts, Maria and Anna. Mum enrolled me at school as Marianne. Then when I was filling out these forms for my tax file, I realised I had various spelling and pronunciation on my legal documents. What a way to cause confusion. Then from the States we have Mary, who says she has two daughters, Rosa Maria and Lucia Filomena, both grandparents. Lucia goes by Lucia, but Rosa Maria, they call her Rosie. But the important thing here is that my daughter Maria asked me why I called myself Mary when your name is Maria like mine. And Mary says, I don't know, they did that to me. Related to the experience described, many participants spoke of the confusion and problems created when various versions of their anglicised names appeared on personal documents, business documents, whatever, and that these names were different from the name that appeared on the birth certificate. Participants recounted that was only when they needed that to access their birth certificate they discovered the strange spelling of their names, or names that were completely different from the ones that they were using. And in some instances, people were telling me this and they were in their 30s. Participants also commented that as a consequence of living in a more security-driven post-9/11 world, was that many found it necessary to either formalise their anglicised names or revert to the Italian pronunciation and spelling of their first names for consistency. Having said that, no participant thus far has indicated that they formalised their anglicised version. They all reverted to the Italian version, pronunciation and spelling. Okay. Now, not all participants, of course, anglicised their names. I begin with a participant and he indicating that neither he nor any other member of his family had anglicised their name. However, he felt that decision might have been costly. My name is a very Italian name. I have never had any inclination to anglicise it, either my first or second name. No one in my family either. My brother had a more difficult name than me. My name and surname has been a problem in Australia since day one. Anecdotally, I know that has not helped. Now, I mean, we're all fairly familiar with this in terms of employment and other issues. Then we have John, an elderly man in the States, who said to me, my father came as a Del Monte and Del Monte stayed. And then, of course, this is a bit long-winded, but I found it interesting as an example to share with you. So Filomena was Philly and Phil, never Filomena, but in the family she was Mena. Then there was Adele, or Adele, who was Dina, but was enrolled at school as Adele, but she didn't realise she was Adele. So of course Mum gets a phone call that says, listen, we think there's a problem with your little one because we reckon she's deaf. And she said, what are you talking about? She's not deaf. And of course she wasn't responding to Adele because she'd never heard it. But then in their teens, the sister said, no, I'm joking this. I introduced myself at Philomena now, my sister started that, She said, bugger that, your name is Philomena, you're going to be called Philomena. I'm Adele, I'm going to be called Adele, and you're Julie, and that's it. Julie. Well, yes. Then we have Antonella, who has 4 children. So she says, even though that some of her friends, or sometimes they in fact use the abbreviation or the shortened, they certainly do everything else in terms of enrolments, schools, documents in their formal Italian. Now, just want to spend a minute or two talking. Oops, I don't want to do that yet. I just want to spend a minute or two talking about pronunciation, because respondents spent considerable time describing their determination to have their Italian, their first name and their surname pronounced correctly. How a person is named and how they are pronounced can play a decisive role in that person's self-identification and their sense of the world. Several researchers write of that an insistence on correct pronunciation of either given or family names is central to demonstrating individual determination to retain ethnic identity and thus fulfilling an internal need to remain connected with the home country or a significant forebear, or both. Now, Loredana, who was quite a forceful person, I introduced myself as that. No abbreviation, no short, not anglicised. She said sometimes at school they called her Laura, but she's Loredana and that's the end of that. Then we have a younger one who says she's the only one in her family who introduces themselves in the, she had an Anglo first name but a very Italian surname, and she insisted that that was pronounced the right way. Then David, he said that for most of his for most of his teenage and early adult life, he just went along with whatever. He too has a very Italian surname, and the Australian version of it is quite different. He went along with it, but lately he is insisting on the Italian. Just a couple more. These are people who went back to Italy, and I have to tell you that those people, in their responses, and it's been consistent whether I was doing regional New South Wales or Pittsburgh or Melbourne, they become quite emotional. Robert, when I went to Italy and people pronounced my name correctly, it was a breath of fresh air. Angelo, one thing I distinctly remember, when you have a surname like mine and you've gone through school with teachers calling you all sorts of surnames because they cannot pronounce your name, you go back somewhere like Mum and Dad's town, straight away they get it, no hassle, no, sorry, can you repeat that, can you spell that again? And then probably my most affectionate one was a 70-year-old from Pittsburgh who said to me, I grew up as Don Angelone, I went to Italy and I found myself, and now I'm Donato Angelone, and every time he writes me an email he does that in bold and capitals. Okay, intergenerational continuity. Many participants spoke of their decision to give Italian names to their children. We're getting to the end. Literature focusing on this issue reports that this usually occurs in third-generation descendants of migrants who have no difficulty interacting in the Anglo society, the dominant Anglo society. They become legitimate, inverted commas, members of the wider Anglo community and are free to look at their family histories and to rediscover and reappraise those components of their Italian cultural heritage that may have been subdued in previous generations. The final extract sums that up beautifully. My 3 children have distinctly Italian names, Bianca, Pia and Fabio. When we were talking about names, I did not change my name when I married, and I have my husband's name, that's very Italian. She thought that the point about the girls' names being, Australia being ready for it is interesting, but of course they weren't ready for Fabio. It's way too early. Okay, so in conclusion, people, in the broadest sense, my research thus far reflects what is represented in the literature. That is, that naming decisions are multifaceted, contextual and influenced not only by culture but also by other constraints or enablers in the host community. There were identifiable differences between the States and Australia, reflecting their specific geographical and technical context. For America, as we know, participants, their parents and grandparents began arriving in the 1890s. This is in terms of my research, but in the Australian context, the earliest was 24. In addition, in the United States, fewer post-World War II arrivals than Australia. Both these factors result in American descendants being predominantly third and fourth generation, whereas Australian participants were primarily second and third. No Australian participant acted on formal name changes, but several American participants did. Americans were more likely to have American names, albeit with an Italian connection. In contrast, Australians were more likely to have been given Italian names that were by them or by somebody else anglicised. In these instances, many respondents said that they had reverted to their Italian name, both pronunciation and spelling. Younger Australian participants are choosing Italian names for their children. There is no evidence in the responses from America. This is not evident in the responses of American participants. My friends, thank you for listening.